Greetings. I'm Dr. George L. Amity, Professor of Political Science, and today what I want to do is cover for Political Science 110, 02, 03, and 04 a lecture on Chapter 12 in our textbook entitled Interest Groups. Our text is Paula McLean and Stephen Talbot, American Government and Black and White, and this is the 2014 edition. Let me begin by defining interest groups. Interest groups are defined as organizations who influence public policy and whose members have a common interest. So you have individuals coming together for the purposes of influencing public policy and public policy making. Now, previously, we talked about political parties, and we made a distinction between political parties and interest groups. Specifically, we said that the primary difference between political parties and interest groups, the difference is that political parties are concerned, yes, with influencing public policy and policy making, but also political parties are concerned with nominating their members to office, winning elections, whereas interest groups are not focused on winning elections for their members, but primarily they are focused on the second part of that, influencing public policy. In the textbook, we begin with a vignette that demonstrates how interest groups compete with one another. The vignette refers to a statement made by Representative Peter King, who was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. King made the statement, and I quote, "There's a growing threat of Islamic radicalism." Well, needless to say, that statement started a thunderstorm or reaction by what's called an interest group, the Council on American Islamic Relations. And many Muslims around the country felt as though his statement was putting them in a very different light, putting them in harm's way, and consequently they reacted, began to put pressure on Congress, and as a result of their pressure, the Senate under Dick Durbin began to have hearings to counter what they considered anti-Muslim hate. So you see, on one hand, pressure is put on, by this group to counter Peter King and the House of Representatives' statements about Islamic terrorism, while on the other hand, the pressure for the more friendly representatives, Senator Dick Durbin, stepped to the plate on behalf of the Council of American Islamic Relations. Another term for interest group is pressure group. And, two examples of interest groups that we're most familiar with is one, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, founded in 1909 to combat problems of lynching, unequal treatment, discrimination, violation of rights and citizenship of African Americans. And that group has worked tirelessly since its founding to pressure, to act as an interest group on behalf of African Americans. A second group mentioned is, that we're all familiar with, is the National Urban League. And the origin of the National Urban League came about under very different circumstances because it was founded shortly thereafter the NAACP, but it was in response to the migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, in an effort to find a better way of life. But when they got there, they found out that it was very difficult to engage in employment. It was very difficult because of discrimination that was going on. And so its mission focused primarily on the economic condition of urban blacks, particularly as a result of the migration from the South to the North. If we look at the framers of the Constitution, the founding father that's most identified with the concept of interest groups is James Madison, who we know was an anti-federalist, but in his paper, the Federalist Papers number 10, he addressed the possibility of the U.S. democracy experiencing considerable conflict. The conflict that he talks about, he refers to this notion of factions, divisions. That is, various divisions within the government all advocating for their particular position. And so Madison had what we call a fear of factions, a fear of factions. And although he considered both political parties and interest groups as factions, he was concerned because he felt that there were some natural divisions in the country. For example, property owners and non-property owners, business people and non-business people, farmers and non-farmers. And his fear was that one of these particular factions would come to power and would particularly concentrate on their particular interests rather than the interests of the society as a whole. So he pointed to the fear of factions. But then he thought factions was also good because he thought the factions were essential for individuals coming together who had a common interest where their interests would be represented through the faction. And this is similar to the position of several political scientists who seem to have very positive and optimistic views about interest groups. And I'm going to talk about three of them: Arthur Bentley, David Truman, and Robert Dahl. And their ideas can be talked about with respect to what we call pluralism. Pluralism. Pluralism is the view that power in the society is group-based and that there are multiple points of access for groups to influence, and that every group has an equality of opportunity. So it becomes a competition between groups. Let me just say that again. The idea of pluralism is that politics is group-based, that there are multiple points of access for groups to apply pressure, and that there's an equality of opportunity. And when groups compete, what we have is the results of in some type of policy or political outcome. Now, Bentley, let me just say this before I talk about the three pluralist writers, because we define our government as a democracy, demos, people. But when you look at American political body politic, if you will, American body politic, you see when we compare it to, say, something like classical Greek democracy, we might consider our current day democracy as a failure. Classical Greek democracy, you had full participation, you had the citizenry engaged in keeping abreast of what was going on. They were very well educated about issues. And thirdly, there was this sense of civic virtue where the priority was what's best for the society as a whole. And of course, if we look at today's American politics, participation is horrid. Sometimes the president is elected by less than half of the people, and by half of half, which is roughly 25%, there's much apathy, much alienation, much withdrawal, not only in terms of being abreast of the issues. You have people who really do not keep abreast of the issues. They engage in blogging, twittering, and most of the time make comments about issues that they're very uneducated about, but that they might feel passionate about. And finally, our today's American politics appear to be self-interested. Everyone is advocating me, myself, and I. So if we compare our today's American politics with the notion of classical Greek democracy, we'll see that we fall considerably short. So this idea of pluralism, I believe, is an attempt by political scientists to actually justify our lack of true democracy. So let's talk about what they say. Let's start off with Arthur Bentley and his book, The Process of Government. And he says that, well, if you want to understand American democracy, American politics, don't look at the structure of the laws, but look at interest group activities. That is the competition between interest groups that result in policy making and policy outcomes. And that this is beneficial in terms of a representative society. So everyone does not have to participate because there are interest groups that represent the interests of everyone. So in terms of a representative democracy, a representative government, pluralism or interest groups or pressure groups, Bentley would consider that's the way to go. Now Truman comes back with his book entitled The Governmental Process. And he sort of reinforces the same notion. He's saying that if you want to measure the stability of a democracy, you need to measure by the number and the existence of interest groups. That interest groups influence public policy, and that political outcomes are a result of these interest groups pursuing their own interests in a competition. Perhaps the most comprehensive writing on pluralism comes from Robert Dahl. And Robert Dahl writes a book entitled Who Governs? And we look at his work in terms of what we call community power studies, where he actually, where we have Bentley and Truman dealing with conceptual frameworks and theories, Dahl actually does an observation or an empirical study of New Haven, Connecticut, to answer the question, who has the power, who governs? Now, Dahl, in his work, concludes these things. One, that politics is group-based, and that the politics, once again, is a byproduct, and the outcomes are a byproduct of competition, a healthy competition among groups. Secondly, he says the competition leads to a balancing. That is to say that no one group, because of wealth and resources, would be overwhelming. For example, if you have one interest group with a lot of wealth and resources, then you would have smaller interest groups that would counter the larger interest groups, so that the competition between groups have a balancing effect where no one interest group dominates and wins all of the time. Thirdly, he says that, well, you have government. And government is a neutral arbiter, or that is, government is a referee that has rules, that ensures that no one group with wealth and resources fully dominates. Oh yes, you have interest groups that pressure, lobby government, but government's primary role is to be neutral and to ensure that everyone is playing by the rules. Fourthly, Dahl found that there were multiple centers of access. That is, with so many interest groups involved and competing, all of them can have access because there are many, many centers. If they can't have access by way of the executive branch, they can have access by way of the judicial branch, they can have access by way of the legislative branch. So there are many individuals and many organizations or agencies and departments that provide multiple avenues of access. Fifthly, he says that change is incremental or gradual. That is, you're not going to have very radical change resulting from interest group activity. And that kind of makes sense because when you're pressuring to change current policy, you have a whole host of interest groups, all probably taking very different positions. And so there's a kind of bargaining that takes place. And then there's a compromise as a result of that bargaining. And it makes sense that the compromise will reflect what pretty much will not deviate very far from the status quo. I mean, because it's the status quo, what already exists is what everyone agrees on. So if there's pressure to change, to deviate from what's already agreed on, then there will probably be a change, but that change will not deviate from what interest groups already agree upon. So once again, his idea is that change under the pluralist system is incremental, gradual, very slow steps. Next, he says there is equal opportunity. There's equal opportunity. And that every group can win. Wow. You know, everyone has an equal opportunity to have their voice heard, because there's so many interest groups, and that because there's so many interest groups, and because there's a competition, because there's a balance, then there are no permanent winners. That some groups win sometimes, some groups win other times. Some groups may win, so that there are no permanent winners and there's no fixed majority or fixed interest group that win all the time. Depending on the issue, that you have different winners at different points. So that's pretty much Dahl's conception of pluralism. Now, what are the criticisms of pluralism? And in the book, we talk about two writers, Schock Snyder and Ted Lowy. Schock Snyder writes a book entitled Semi-Sovereign People. And he counters this pluralist argument by saying, well, the pluralists are wrong. Not everyone is represented by interest groups. Some people are not part of interest groups, neither are their interests being represented by interest groups. He even says, and this is the way I see it, is that the current system has an income bias, that it appeals to those who are upper class and have more money, that resources and wealth do matter. He puts it like this: it's a pluralist heaven that sings with an upper class accent. More money, more influence. Less money, less influence. Ted Lowy, or Theodore Lowy, in his book, The End of Liberalism, goes even further and says not only everyone is not represented and that wealth and income matters, but that the most of the decisions and the power lies with a few. He speaks of what's called an iron triangle. This iron triangle has 3 points. You have congressional, committees, and subcommittees. One point. You have bureaucratic agencies and departments.